All right, thanks so much for being here and joining us for our measurement enthusiast session. I'm Joe McFall, and I'm an associate professor of psychology at the State University of New York in Fredonia, New York. And I'll let my co-host introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Scott Meier. I'm a professor at the State University of New York in Buffalo, New York.
I think measurement's an exciting topic, and I think that there's a lot of conversation going on in psychology related to replication crisis, measurement. There's a lot of conversation about why effects may or may not replicate. I think a big part of it is good measurement practices. And so that led me to reading a really fascinating book that Scott had written. And I got in touch with him and said, I think these are really exciting ideas. And I noticed that you wrote the book maybe 20 years ago, and we're still struggling with the same issues in psychology and other sciences related to how we think about and do measurement. And so I think I thought it'd be exciting to continue to have dialogue. And at the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science, I create a little roundtable discussion about measurement. And people from a lot of different countries attended, and we just took turns kind of talking about our research interests and how measurement practices are important in what we do. And a lot of the same themes came up. And I thought that one of the themes that was interesting was people thought about, how can we embed measurement-related research questions into other projects? And I'm relatively new to PSA, but to me, I was very interested in the Metta science group, and that's a newer part of PSA. And I thought that it could be fun to have some sort of measurement-related project embedded into a meta science component for PSA projects, or in general to think about how can groups of people who are interested in improving measurement get together, have conversations, and come up with some initiatives that can have big impact with moderate effort. So I'll take this opportunity to maybe ask Scott to say a few words, and then we can kind of go over some of our goals for the session.
Sure. And Joe, I think there's a question in the chat that you might be able to answer better than I can. And
yeah, the meta science group, I think there's a meta science committee that is interested in examining research questions that can be embedded into existing PSA projects with the data that's being collected that might not be central to the original PSA project research questions. So for example, if there were people studying some concept across many countries, and we could have a proposal to look at measurement invariance, for example, across those countries on that construct. But that's not part of the original project, but with their permission and the Meta Science and PSA director's permission and the approval of the overall association, there might be an opportunity to do that extra step.
yeah, and I appreciate Joe taking the initiative to talk with me about this and to set up this session, because I've been interested in measurement for many decades, and wrote a book called The Chronic Crisis in Psychological Assessment and Measurement that was published in 1994, and kind of reviewed the history of psychological testing, and basically seeing a lot of issues that would come up, the state trade issue, the controversies about intellectual testing that would come up and appear for about a decade or so and then disappear for lack of resolution. And Joe and I have also talked a bit about when you look at problems like the replication crisis, one of the underlying issues may relate to measurement, and whether our measurement devices are essentially I don't want to say too primitive, but again, psychology being a relatively young science, that we're still dealing with how to measure many of the constructs, phenomena of interest. And so there remains some very basic questions about how we should measure in our various areas of psychology. For example, I work in the counseling clinical area, and some of my recent publications are look at ceiling effects on working alliance measures in counseling and psychotherapy, overlap, discriminant validity in occupational stress and burnout, and also implicit bias in teacher ratings of children's kind of social emotional topics. And in all of those areas, the measurement questions are very basic, and I think in some ways the lack of knowledge we have in those areas is really inhibiting progress in our understanding of that. So again, I credit Joe with the idea for this session, and part of it was, can we find other people that are interested in collaborating? We'd like to hear from you about what your measurement areas are and what you think about how measurement affects your research. And I'm not sure how many people do we have at this point. Joe, can you tell?
Looks like there's 17 of us in the room.
Okay, so that may be a small enough group for people, if you feel comfortable, to talk a bit about some of your interest in measurement and how it affects your research.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I'd love to go around. I'll say really briefly that I've talked to a lot of folks in a couple other sessions in the past, and a lot of people say that one common theme they're interested in is training related to measurement, that there's so much to learn in grad school, for example. There's not a lot of time to devote to some of the complexities of looking at measurement issues. And then in general, there's another theme that emerged was there's maybe a culture that once we submit one paper to say that we measured some constructs reliably, then no one wants to really go back and look at reliability and validity work over time because it's not exciting and sexy. But we assume that maybe measurement could change over time. So at that point, I thought, like Scott said, let's go around, and whoever would like to jump in and tell us a little bit about your interests and measurement related to your interests, please go ahead.
Okay, so I may start. It's very good to be here with you and to see the measurements enthusiasts gathered in one place. I study mostly dehumanization and other forms of prejudice, and I am interested in how do we actually conceptualize humanity in the concept of dehumanization. And my major project is actually dealing with the measurement of dehumanization per se, and how do we do we have really a valid inferences from the measurements. I came up with the idea that maybe some of the questionnaires that we give to the people are actually producing the variables rather than measuring them, because we force people to respond to the topics that they may not ever get interested in and don't really have an actual opinion. We just ask them to present any opinion, and they do. And I think that this is the issue that we almost never consider, that we may actually produce rather than measure. And the second thing with measurements that I am interested in, it's how many of our measurements are properly tied to any behavioral outcomes. How good are we at predicting actual behavior that may be saw with the naked eye? And do we care about this? Because I get the impression when I was in the undergraduate programs that almost every questionnaire is being validated with another questionnaires. So is there a mother of all questionnaires somewhere, mitochondrial Eve of questionnaires? And yeah, is this a good way to do it? Or maybe at some point, or ideally at every point, we should go back to behaviors, to behavioral criterion validity. So yeah, this is the two topics that I'm currently interested in, and try to read and even write something about it.
Well, those are fascinating questions. Thank you for sharing. I mean, with the last point reminds me of kind of the controversy decades ago about the relationship between attitudes and behaviors. And I don't know that there was really any resolution to that question.
Yeah, that's you bring up some wonderful points. I've thought a couple times in the past about, you know, a lot of times in experimental areas, we intentionally calibrate the materials to elicit the effect we're looking for, to the point where, you know, it may lose some ecological validity, but the point is, can we produce this effect? And if we can, then maybe it exists. But then we don't often want to go back and then see how much that effect exists naturally, or, you know, how strong that is naturally without all of our calibrations. And I think you bring up a really good point about, with measurement, how do we make sure that we're not producing effects we're looking for in our research design? So I think that's a wonderful question. Who else would love to chime in?
I would like to chime in. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So my research is on how people with dyslexia and people who stammer recognize words. And one of the key things is I have to use a suite of standardized tests. And as a result, we have to put them in a principal component analysis. And the problem I've encountered when I was doing this was that we always assume that the measurements were always reliable. And they keep saying, oh, the construct validity and the reliability of these measurements can be applied to any group of people. But then when we say, oh, it works for neurotypical, it doesn't apply. We don't need to worry about how it applies to those with neurodiverse conditions, because people with dyslexia and people with who stammer will process everything similarly, even though they may encounter similar difficulties in these areas. So then it kind of raised more questions on the reliability of these measurements. And I think that was one of the key things that interested me, is about how cognitive diversity and neurodiversity may affect how they may affect these the scales of the reliability and validity, and that perhaps this may be a problem because what we're saying is being beneficial to one particular group may not be applicable to another group. And this kind of got me thinking about how it would apply to cultural and linguistic diversity as well. So that was where my interest for methodological reform came in, and also because I read, and also the other reason is that after reading a fantastic book by Professor Arnold Chittisev, he talked about how psychology may have gone too fast into theory construction without thinking too much about methodological development, especially since physics has gone through that with temperature in France, where they used to think of how to create a thermometer based on what is the basic room temperature, and one of the ideas was butter, putting it in a room filled with butter. So that's why I'm also interested.
I don't know if you'd be willing to share that reference on chat at some point, but that sounds like a great read.
Yeah, I'm excited about opportunities like PSA, where you could potentially take you know, some of the research questions that you're talking about can be very challenging when a lot of studies purposely try to avoid measuring individuals who may have a different way of functioning, because they want to try to make conclusions about the norm or the typical group. And so we don't really know how many folks of more diverse neurological conditions are participating in research, but then we often don't intentionally measure people who process information differently, partially because it's hard to find people. And so with a large scale initiative, even if we find a few people at lots of different sites, we might have enough data to actually intentionally look at measurement concerns for subgroups. So I think that's a really exciting point. Thanks for putting that in their chat. Who else would love to chime in?
I can make people feel good about themselves. So I'm Darren Rogers. My background, training-wise, sounds like it's fairly similar to Dr. Meier's. My PhD was clinical psych at Ohio State, and it was in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, and at that time I was getting some of my professors teaching me some really fascinating things that then just disappeared and never appeared again, kind of in any official professional capacity or educational capacity. I learned about multi-trait, multi-method matrices. I learned about some wonderful stuff. I mean, we read, there's a great quant psych program there. And so my quant psych teachers, professors were teaching some great stuff about critically considering your measurements, critically considering things like reliability and validity in ways that it's been rare for me even to find other people with PhDs from similar schools to have considered. So I think I got a good mix, an interesting mix of people. And since then, it's been sort of like self-education as I just realized I can't get away from the issues of measurement. I wouldn't say I'm a measurement person, but I might like to be. But I've done a lot of measurement stuff. Goodness, I spent 5 or 6, 7 years working with some people who were, with a guy who was one of Costa and McCrae's kind of field researchers trying to come up with valid, like culturally and linguistically valid bilingual measures of a dozen or so different psychological measures so we could do some personality research in Mexico and in the United States. And I've been very interested in cross-cultural research, and I've been struck by some of the same things that the people who have spoken already have mentioned, specifically that we often just take for granted that things are cross-culturally valid, and not just cross-culturally, I'm in another country, but cross-culturally, like now I'm dealing with multi-class or working class people instead of college students, you know, their children or whatever. And I study things that are hard to measure. I study sexual aggression and sexual abuse as kind of my main area of research. So I'm not core clinical. And that stuff is really hard to measure in some ways. It's hidden, it's low frequency, it's, you know, there's low base rates on this kind of stuff. And there are issues with definition of terms and trying to make sure that the way people understanding your questions are what you intend. I mean, basic stuff, but it feels like the problems get difficult when you get these things where if somebody answers a certain way and if they don't trust your, or if your confidentiality on your survey doesn't hold, they could go to prison and never be able to live near a school for the rest of their life, things like that. So I've been fascinated with all these things. I can't get around issues of measurement. They're constantly there. I've developed a couple of measures, published a couple, developed a lot more that I've never published. I developed a measure a little while ago that I didn't publish in time, but it's a semantic inconsistency scale. Dr. McFall and I are going to try and publish that eventually when I finally get around to writing more than I'm writing now, obviously. But yeah, I'm fascinated with the entire area. Like, I can't get around measurement, and I find that I'm more interested in many ways in issues of measurement and how it's affecting the field, like especially the large things people are talking about, how that's affecting our replicability crisis, how that's affecting like blithe assumptions that we seem to make, which a lot of people just don't seem concerned about.
Right.
Like, yeah, I'm really fascinated with all this stuff.
I think those are great points. I mean, it's almost like we've accepted the current level of where we're at, and partially because no one, there's really no consensus about how to move forward. Thank you.
If there's a little bit of time, I'd like to chime in too. I am Nadia. I am in Mexico. My background is in, well, I have a BA in psychology, but then I got a PhD in neuroscience. So I have stumbled into measurement in neuroscience in the States. And I came back to Mexico to be a professor here, and I've been here for a few years. So I have stumbled into measurement because we can't do all the scales and all the measurement that I used to do in the States. I have to revalidate in Mexico. You can't use the same things in the same way, and they don't mean the same thing necessarily. So weirdly, the past 5 years, I've validated measures, created measures so that I can actually do the science I want to do. So I've started to become a measurement person, and I'm very interested in looking at how I can better measure the things that I want to measure. And it's funny, I just taught, I teach grad methods courses. And one of the things that we just taught, that I just taught was the multi-trait, multi-method tables that I think are really fascinating, that we don't use anymore. People just say, oh, it was validated by so-and-so. And even if you use it in Mexico, they say, oh, it was validated in the States like 40 years ago, and so we're going to use it, and it's valid in Mexico then. Or they just put in a Cronbach's alpha, and it's like, oh, it's a valid measure. And it's like, well, is it though? So it's one of those things that I really try to get my students to try to do when they're doing, especially when they're measuring things that are hard to measure. In my field, I'm not a clinical psychologist at all, but I'm interested in the biological basis of psychiatric disorders. So it is one of those things that are like really hard to measure as well, and that have a lot of measurement issues due to a lot of overlap. I'm very interested in it for both my research to teach them as well.
Very cool. I mean, what I resonated there was you talked about stumbling into measurement, and I feel like that's what happened to me too. And I suspect that is a common experience for other people that are here today.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been, I know with the SPAML project that is getting started, that the language issue is a really big component of the project, not only because the project is about language, but also because it has to be translated and back translated and compared and contrasted across many languages. And if the problem were only vocabulary, then that would be one thing, but the problem is also conceptual in how we use language in culture. So that's a very interesting challenge that I do not understand how to tackle.
I'm not sure the field does. I mean, the issues with back translation, are you getting the constructs right too? It seems I'm hearing that from people as they talk.
Who else wants to chime in?
I'd be happy to say something. So my name is Hans Eisermann. I'm Hans Roche Eisermann. I live in France, but I'm from the Netherlands. My main area of research is temperature regulation and the social aspects of temperature regulation. I guess I also stumbled into measurement because I'm trained as a social psychologist, so we don't get a lot of training in measurement, unfortunately. So we've also become more active in this area and kind of evaluating just generally how we do measurement in the sub area that I work on. What we're kind of interested in now is the degree to which kind of peripheral temperature variations in response to ambient temperature can be indicative of individual differences, both in terms of sensitivity to temperature, but also people's desire to regulate temperature socially. And we also developed a skill on this topic that correlates generally pretty highly with attachment avoidance, so people's desire to regulate temperature. The original skill that we developed in 12 different countries, which had some problems with measurement equivalence. So we've now tried to develop a skill in 40 different countries where people in these different countries come up with behaviors that they think are indicative of temperature regulation and social temperature regulation, to try to get to a better skill that works across the different countries. And I think one of the major things that will be challenging is to see how these skills will be comparable across different countries, because we may actually come up with different skills in different countries, and to see then how we would compare them across these different countries as well as we can, if it's even possible. So I guess that's kind of the bigger challenge that we're confronted with. And I guess that one of the potential solutions may be a network analysis to try to see how different networks, how these are different networks in different countries.
Interesting.
So it's actually a very basic concept, temperature regulation, more basic than I think complicated things like sexual aggression or psychopathology. So temperature regulation is very basic also to other animals. But I think that already is very complicated if you compare it across different countries, because the way that people regulate their temperature will be different in one environment versus another, because you wear different clothes, or some people have central heaters and others people do not.
No, I mean, that's,
Go ahead.
yeah, it's fascinating stuff. I mean, again, it reminds me of some of the basic work on kind of pain detection and, you know, just measurable differences. So it's interesting that, you know, even these kind of really basic sensations that we try to measure, there's such complications there with that.
Right.
And even from a linguistic perspective, so some countries only have 2 temperature terms, for example, such as hot and cold. Others say, so English, you can also say lukewarm, warm, hot, cold. But so the languages vary in terms of how you can express temperature. And also, for example, in French, you use to make warm if it's about the ambient temperature, whereas tactile temperature, you say it is warm. So even those kind of very subtle variations are very complicated already in terms of linguistic differences.
Cool.
Yeah, that's it. I was thinking, you know, one of the challenges I tend to encounter, especially I've tried to assist some other folks with some projects, is when we have we find that, you know, maybe the meaning does vary by group. Then we kind of default to, well, we'll just analyze things separately for each group. And then we of course introduce all kinds of potential problems into our research. One is we no longer can model all the interesting effects across all of our participants. So we have some power issues. We start to perform so many analyses that statistically we're introducing all kinds of error into our analyses. So, but then what is your alternative if you can't establish that you're measuring the same thing? So. Yeah, this is a really fascinating problem that I think would be fun to work on tackling.
Well, there do seem to be a number of people with interest in this area, so that's cool.
Just a quick aside, I put into the chat a little link if you wanted to have more conversation after today. You can just put your email in there, and then you know, no obligation to continue, but if you did want to be contacted and potentially stay involved in some fashion, we could periodically send out an update or create some sort of group online that people can maybe join. So feel free to do that. And then if you have any ideas that you want to type into a document, the session information where you click the link had another link below it, below the Zoom link for a collaborative document. So feel free to edit that. If you have any problem editing it, let me know. I think the share settings should be okay, but that's just a place anyone can chime in. Who else would love to give us a few ideas?
Do I see a hand up there?
Can I?
Please.
Oh, well, I'm Deborah. I'm a professor in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I have worked in working memory, measuring also individual differences and experimental approaches. And there you have the age-old problem of when you maximize internal variance for an experiment, you lose reliability of individual differences. So I was trained in psychometrics. I've also worked a lot in adaptation and validation of ability and neuropsychological tests from the psychometric point of view. So I know these problems of equivalence, linguistic equivalence, cultural equivalence. We've done a lot of work on that. And I wanted to pick up on one of the ideas I think suggested by you, Joseph, that I think it might be a good idea to look into PSA projects that might have questions or questionnaires or measures of individual differences. For example, the COVID initiatives that have used questionnaires, and maybe we could like analyze that from the psychometric point of view. I don't know if within those projects they have intended or planned this type of analysis, like reliability, differential item functioning, things like that from the psychometric point of view. So one thing you said, I think, which is interesting, is that we could go over the PSA projects and see whether some or any of those have these kind of data to reanalyze from a psychometric point of view, or maybe compare with confirmatory factor analysis, whether they are measuring the same constructs or with the same construct structure. Sorry, my English, and sorry, my camera.
Oh, that's wonderful. No, I totally agree. I think it's a great idea, and I would be happy to get in touch with some of the leads on some of the projects that do have some kind of questionnaire type data, and they may be interested in collaborating on that exact type of a project, because often I think it can take so much work to do all the measurement psychometric work that it's a little beyond the scope of maybe the original research question, but the data is there, and I'm sure that in a lot of cases people would be happy to invest in that project. So let's if you fill out the little form, the little Google form, please, there's a little place for comments. Maybe feel free to put in a couple ideas in the comments area of what you might want to work on, and then I'm going to put my email also in the chat. Anyone else who would like to, feel free if you wanted to email directly about an idea, but the collaborative document and the Google form, we'll follow up on too. So thanks so much.
Natalia?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm not sure. Just let me know if the audio is weird. No, just a quick heads up about what I do. I'm a developmental psychologist. I'm a member of PSA, currently an assistant director to one of the committees. And I think I focus more on the part of meta science instead of the part of measurement when I joined the session. But I do work with experimental tasks and cognitive tasks. So currently I'm struggling with issues of validation, but in tasks and not in questionnaires, although it's something that also concerns any kind of research, psychological research. So just to let you know where I'm at. I do some sort of bibliometric, I try to do some sort of bibliographic and bibliometric work. It's kind of on hold now, but it's where I think I've been doing some of meta science work that I'm interested in. But anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I will definitely note your interest and be in touch.
Is that a question? Sorry.
And then in the chat, I believe there's some suggestions that we could explore for some PSA multi-site work.
So one of the studies that I referenced is not a PSA study.
Oh, okay.
It uses all the PSA characteristics, so the data management, etc. But it has the IPIP, Big Five, experience in close relationships, a skill on temperament, an eating questionnaire, perceived stress skill, BIS-BAS, interpersonal reactivity index, 3-domain discuss skill, the multidimensional assessment of interceptive awareness. So it's a large battery of questionnaires in more than 40 countries. So that could actually be useful for a measurement project. Also, we will release the data in 2 phases. So we'll release the data first, the 2/3 of the data, then people can pre-register hypothesis. So we have about 7,000 participants right now, and data collection will close in at the end of January, I think.
Oh, wow, that's wonderful. Thank you. Others have want to kind of share a little bit about their, oh yeah, Ming.
Hi, maybe I can hear me.
Yes.
So maybe I can share a little bit about my my ideas or background. So I'm from the Faculty of Education at University of Cambridge. My research is a little bit interdisciplinary. So it's about, it's between educational psychology and second language acquisition. And I think one of the biggest headaches I have with regards to measurement is discriminant validity. So it's like, there's just super high sort of between factor correlations of the constructs that you know, I don't know what to do. It's like a gambling game, you know, I don't know which variables I can keep, you know, get to keep after this, you know, sort of lengthy process of data collection. So there's really a serious issue with sort of measurement validity in my field. But people don't really care that much. They just pretty much whatever you guys have described, like just that, you know, some people did something a couple of years ago and then I can use it or something like that.
Right.
And so that's really, to me, an issue. And I think a lot of the sort of the reproducibility crisis, it's really sort of underpinned by this problem. And also, I think the jingle jangle problem, like people proposing new constructs, but are they really new constructs, or you're just putting a new label, right, on the old one or whatever? And also sometimes I wonder, like, is the relationship we discovered is really the relationship between the construct we are interested in or the just a manifest of the items being really similar, you know, so it's something like that. So yeah, so that's why I feel it's not like my expertise is in measurement, but it's more about I have to deal with that before I can get to what I want to do. The other thing is, I guess recently I got interested in quantitative text analysis. And from what I've heard that you guys are describing about linguistic stuff, you know, linguistic equivalence and et cetera, I think maybe there is some scope for, you know, using, you know, like techniques such as word embedding, you know, like word vectors, that kind of models to sort of test the validity from a linguistic perspective. So that might be something, I don't know, but it's just an idea that I thought of, you know, while listening to you guys. Yeah.
Do you have any references that you could post to the chat about that?
It's just the word embedding models. It's not like I have read anything particularly with regards to validity. It's just something connection that I'm making, because I think word embedding models really to turn words into vectors so that we can measure them in vector space and we can see the similarity between words in terms of the numerical values. And I guess that's of some value. If we're, for example, if we want to see, are these items really similar in a sense or different in a sense? So that might be helpful, but I haven't read anything sort of actually doing that.
Okay. Well, I mean, your talk about the discriminant validity really resonates for me because I just see that all over the place when I teach a measurement course and ask students to write a paper that looks at psychometric properties of whatever construct they're interested in measuring, and just finding discriminant validity information is typically very difficult. And then it's also interesting to see what people label as convergent and discriminant validity. What correlation of 0.2 is seen as convergent, and a correlation of 0.5 might be seen as discriminant. And you know, it all depends on the context, but we really don't seem to have much consensus about what is really discriminant validity. And so it tends to be ignored and not reported.
Yeah, I think those are really important considerations. I found a lot of times in kind of reanalyzing some data, I've seen things like reversed items hanging together better than the kind of intentional construct people were trying to measure, or so other, and I've also been interested in common method bias in survey questionnaires. So I think there's a lot of really interesting things here, and it's always easier to get a publication by inventing a new term than it is by doing good integrative work and showing that concepts are similar across areas. And so there's kind of the incentives of science of the least publishable unit kind of inhibit some progress in some of the measurement work, I think. But I think there's a lot of publications to be had for continuing to do psychometric work and publishing that. And one other kind of observation I was thinking about as you were chatting was, I often see these people citing kind of these rules of thumb from 1990 for what is the target for some kind of statistical test of something like an effect that they're interested in, whether it's meaningful. And 90% of the time, it seems that these rules of thumb came from some simulation study with very, very basic parameters that was performed that doesn't really apply to most of the studies that are citing that rule of thumb. And so in general, rules of thumb tend to be problematic and give us kind of a false sense of belief. And we cherry pick the rules of thumb that we want.
Others, anyone else, please.
Well, I could jump in just very quickly. Hello, everyone. My name is Matti. I'm from Finland, University of Jyväskylä, and I come from a more philosophical and qualitative research background, and I'm just very curious, more observing and listening than probably being able to contribute much. But it's very fascinating. My research concerns technology use, and my interest in measurement started some time ago when there has been for many decades since the 80s long discussions about technology addiction, and clinical psychologists and a lot of psychologists over the decades have been talking about this construct, and I was very fascinated about how to create such constructs. So what does it mean to be addicted, for instance? And when you move to look at the psychological literature, basically a lot of experts just simply skipped these questions and started creating the questionnaires, such as you have 9 items, and then if you meet the cutoff of 5 out of 9, you're addicted. That's it. And then eventually, starting from next year, January, there will be the first technology addiction in the ICD-11. And still 0 out of these constructs, these measures that are currently being used have still been clinically validated. So none of the research that, none of the measures that basically measure such behavior has been validated with actual populations. So nobody has ever seen a person who is addicted, but we already have more than 100 peer-reviewed measures for questioners how to identify these true measures, but we don't have really those real populations. So this notion of construct is very interesting to me, how such constructs are created and how do we connect our measures to these constructs. And I bet there are a lot of different ways for doing that. So very, very fascinated to hear about these things.
I think the qualitative approach is interesting. I mean, sometimes when I read some of the measurement literature, I almost feel like we've jumped to a quantitative approach too quickly without really understanding the constructs very thoroughly that we're trying to measure. And in some ways, we may just need to step back and do more qualitative work before we attempt to, I mean, just for the construct explication step of, trying to understand in some depth what it is we're trying to measure.
Yeah, and I see a lot of interesting qualitative work where people have really kind of thought through the process of starting with, of the kind of the discussion with people to try to tease apart what they're interested in measuring, going through the research process, triangulating back, bringing results back to participants and focus groups to kind of think through some of the conclusions of their research and see if it is meaningful to people. And I think that's a fun approach in a lot of domains. And of course, there's lots of areas of psychology where, we're assuming that people may not be able to report or understand the process that we're interested in measuring. But for a lot of projects, I think we do definitely kind of assume about what we're measuring rather than and assume that the stats will tell us if our assumptions were right. But if we have biases in the measurement process or issues that we don't think about that affect the outcomes, then we can be led into false conclusions. So I think there's a lot of fun ideas there to explore. Anyone else want to tell us a little bit about some of their research ideas or measurement interests?
There is one more idea, but I don't know how relevant it is. So if it's not a good idea, just tell me. Because one of my colleagues works in the animal field, and really enough, they created a questionnaire to test certain behaviors that humans encounter, such as depression, into animals to see about animal welfare and enrichment. And I was just wondering, what kind of measurement issues could get involved? Because the only thing I keep thinking of is that this is more of anthropomorphism. And I don't know if that's a measurement issue or if it's a conceptual issue. And this might be just me not having a lot of knowledge about it.
What do people think?
This is something I've thought about before, actually. And my first initial thought is, if you're already trying to measure a mental health condition in an animal, such as depression, then there is already an assumption of anthropomorphism in there. So we can choose to go ahead with that inherent assumption and assume that the people that are the companions of these animals will have some insight, or we must not impose human originated theories of mental health on animals. That's my 2 cents.
Interesting, yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I have one comment on this technology addiction issue, because it's very core to what I think that the main concerns with the measurements are in general. Like, we don't know yet what it means to be addicted. We don't know who is addicted and who is not. And then how can we create a measurement when we don't have the possible criterion validity? What will happen probably is that we will come up with some measurement, and by this measurement we will define the addiction, which is actually going in circles, because you are creating a construct by measurement and not making sure that the construct is being measured properly. So I think, yeah, it's a big problem. And in all this conversation, when we talk about measurement, we intuitively think about questionnaires, and that's another I think grand theme in psychology, that actually we are just asking people about stuff all the time, and a lot of this, I believe, comes from convenience. It's just the most convenient way to do research. But at some point, maybe we overlook the fact that these questions were initially made to be some not very good ersatz of actually observing behaviors. and now we think that questionnaires is all we have, all the best thing we have. I think that maybe we are falling into this trap a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of the, some of the strongest measures from a psychometric point of view are the, I hate to call them intelligence measures because I think there's issues with that. But essentially we're asking people to perform behaviors or, to do cognitive or memory tasks. And, those measures have very strong reliability, for example, and an amazing range of validity evidence for them and all the different things that they're able to predict. I mean, not always very well, but, just the range of things. And again, those are kind of performance measures as opposed to asking people about their memory or whatever. So yeah, I agree with you. I mean, part of the problem I think with measurement is, at least in the US, there's not a lot of grant support to investigate measurement related issues. In fact, I know of none. I mean, essentially you may be able to do that by, piggybacking onto other studies, but these issues I think have been so vexing that at least attempts in the US in the past to, to fund studies have gone away. And so that's part of the problem. It's almost everybody is using the approach that takes the least resources, and which is to develop a questionnaire. I know at one point in the US, the American Psychological Association estimated there were like 20,000 self-report questionnaires created every year. And I would suspect it's not much less than that now. So it's the easiest way. The field kind of accepts self-reports, questionnaires as a reliable and valid way of doing things. And so that's where we are.
Can I say also, there is this thing, for example, in the construct of flexibility, which has been, that we have questionnaires of cognitive self-regulation, flexibility, or stuff like that. And we have performance measures, and they don't measure the same thing.
Right.
So one thing is self-reported cognitive control, flexibility, or whatever. And the other thing is what you measure with Stroop or performance tasks. So which is the real flexibility, which is a real construct, or are both different constructs? Or so it's not that one comes to the help of the other. So maybe they are both different constructs.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great example. I was also thinking of the intelligence example, but in the context of creating defining a construct by what's measured versus measuring the definition of a construct, right? Because there's only certain things that we can find a way to measure, and so then we end up either intentionally or unintentionally defining constructs by what we can measure easily.
Right.
So I think that's an interesting point. Anyone else wanted to chime in their research interests or measurement interests? I think we might have
Natalia has her hand up.
Oh, okay, great.
No, yeah, it's just really following what Deborah said. I'm a newbie in cognitive testing, so I've been conducting studies in executive function tasks with children, and I'm interested in how reports, self-reports or reports from parents and teachers, I'm curious how they are correlated or not with the students' performances in those tasks and their behavior in the real world, as we call it, so the ecological validity of these measures. And it's very intriguing because when you look at the reviews and analysis on the topic, it's a widely studied studied topic. They sometimes find things like the reports have larger effect sizes and they correlate with some measures of academic achievement because they're interested in looking at how children better at self-regulation perform in schools, for example. But the tasks have lower effect sizes, and both of them predict somewhat what children do at how children perform in schools. Sometimes they don't correlate. So I think maybe Deborah has an opinion on that, but the general perception is that people are probably talking about different things, or a lot of things clumped together, and they don't know exactly what they're talking about.
Right.
But it's a very interesting topic on how these measures will show some invariance or not, and why.
Yeah, we don't seem to have good theories to explain that. I mean, what I hear you talking about and where I do work is informant discrepancies. That is, if you're trying to assess children's kind of social and emotional behavior, you get different data from the children, from the parents, from the teachers, from a counselor. And there's really not been, to me at least, a convincing rationale for why those differences appear.
I know there's a few points in the chat. Did anyone in the chat want to say anything verbally about it? Oh, yep.
I want to make a point that what Dr. Meier was just mentioning is something I keep running into. I want to study my substantive stuff, or at least, well, I want to study measurement, but I start studying my substantive area, and no matter whether it's my area or another area that I become interested in, do some reading in, I very frequently, maybe almost always, end up at measurement issues, and then the measurement issues take me back to the substance. Like you're mentioning, so the question of whether, like, say, the Achenbach child, like the CBCL, why are the parent reports and the child reports giving us different things? Why are the teacher reports and the parent reports giving us different things? We have intuitive understandings. Well, they see different parts of the child's life, but that intuitive understanding isn't a formal theory, right? And we're supposed to be doing science. And then if you look at stuff like, yeah, I have measures that are kind of question-based measures, trying to estimate whether somebody has committed sexual aggression or is likely to commit sexual aggression. And then I have an analog kind of game-playing measure, like some other people in the field, but a little bit different, that has people do things, kind of quote-unquote do things in sort of like a choose-your-own-adventure text thing, to see if they're, as a different way to estimate their likelihood to maybe commit sexual aggression if a certain circumstance came around. And those don't correlate perfectly. So why not? And so then you end up thinking about not measurement anymore, but, well, measurement, but measurement takes you back to, like, do we understand what people are?
Right.
Do we understand what cognition is? Do we understand how any of this stuff works? And we obviously understand a lot of stuff, but there are some gaps, and the measurement brings us back to some very big gaps in fundamental assumptions about psychology in pretty much any field, I think, any subfield.
Right. I think, these kind of measurement issues are in some ways are markers of kind of the limits of our knowledge in different fields. And to the extent that we investigate some of these measurement issues, I think we have the opportunity to advance our areas theoretically. And I'm thinking particularly of some of the recent work that people have been doing on ceiling effects with working alliance measures. And the working alliances is that idea that in therapy, clients connect kind of holistically with their therapist. The interesting thing about the working alliance measures is they show ceiling effects very early with clients. Session 1, session 2, people are showing, large numbers of people are showing that they're going towards the top of these ceilings. And the assumption has been that these the two questions about this is, are these scales been improperly developed? And they're all showing ceiling effects when, you know, these different measures were badly developed, or is that telling us something theoretically about what's going on in the development of the alliance? And my guess at this point is that it's giving us feedback that people are developing this working alliance in psychotherapy much faster and abruptly. It's almost like a threshold effect than the field has recognized. So again, for me, the importance there is the measurement. The odd measurement effect we're seeing tells us something important about theory that we haven't recognized. And I just wonder in how many areas that's going on. And I apologize for speaking so much. I think as people talk about this stuff, it gets me excited because it's fun to find another group of people that are interested in these issues. And it is, I just have to say, I'm thrilled to be with a group of folks that are noticing some of the same things that Joe and I have been talking about.
Yeah, I was wondering what people thought would be the best next steps. So, you know, I kind of came up with a couple ideas that I put in the session description. So, you know, one is taking a big data set and starting to play around with some measurement related research questions. And then, you know, I thought of advocacy related things, you know, working with other professional organizations to see whether they have any measurement related initiatives ongoing or would be willing to consider that. Working with publishers or journals, for example, to think about standards for what should be included in papers related to things that are measured and how measurement works, or whether it's lobbying related to accreditation programs or graduate program curricula related to helping to provide some training to make people more comfortable with measurement. What other ideas do you have? And what did you want to work on? Or what would you be interested in doing next? Like a meta science project with PSA on measurement, or what are your interests? I did see a chat message about some occasional measurement related meta science projects with PSA, or also measurement like sessions over like summer. I often see some really cool workshops over summer, and a lot of times they're pretty expensive. I think that's a big barrier for a lot of folks when we don't necessarily get all the training that we might want or need in graduate programs. Then to try to engage in professional development after often costs a lot of money for workshops. So it would be really cool to get access for everyone to a lot of that great training at a low cost or free way. Some mention like Coursera courses, but yeah, other thoughts? Another chat message was about, like study swap type things. I agree that sometimes, we're kind of learned out, especially for what our goals are. And there's people out there who are the experts in these areas. So kind of matching people up is a great idea. I think that could be a good possibility for folks in this kind of group. And crowdsourcing is a great idea. for funds. Yeah, these are really great ideas. I'm excited about what's being posted in the chat ideas.
Well, I think one of the things we might be able to do, Joe, is summarize some of these ideas after this session. And again, if people have signed up was on the Google Docs, maybe share some of that with folks and see if we can get some, at least subgroups, if not many of these folks, to continue to have some kind of contact, and see if we can pursue any of this.
Yeah, I'll definitely get in touch with the Metta Science folks and PSA and anyone else who would be willing to do that with me. Please reach out. And then are there any other kind of next steps people had in mind? Well, thanks so much for the conversation. I thought it was really, really helpful and exciting to hear all of your ideas. So I think there's no need to stay the whole time if we've pretty much summarized our main ideas. And so yeah, Scott and I will kind of work on some summary information, and you can continue to, as you come up with ideas throughout this conference or after, if you wanted to post anything in that collaborative document, feel free, and then we can incorporate your ideas into some of our summary work, and we'll let you know what comes of our next steps.
Thanks for everyone for attending. I appreciate that and your willingness to share.